Hello and welcome to Scripture Untangled, a podcast by the Canadian Bible Society. My name is Joanna Lafleur. I'm a friend of the Canadian Bible Society, and I'm going to be your guide for today's episode. Today, Ray Aldred will be interviewed by CBS Ambassador Andrew Stirling. Today's guest is Reverend Dr. Ray Aldred. He is a respected theologian, pastor, and teacher whose life's work has been to see the gospel take root in every heart, language, and cultural context. Ray is a status Cree from the Swan River Band in Treaty 8 territory, and he currently serves as the director of the Indigenous Studies Program at the Vancouver School of Theology. His mission is to partner with the Indigenous Church in theological education that is contextual, faithful, and empowering. Ordained in both the Christian and Missionary Alliance and now in the Anglican Church of Canada, Ray brings decades of pastoral and academic leadership. Together with his wife, Elaine, Ray has also served in healing and marriage ministries, especially supporting those who've experienced trauma or abuse. They now live in Richmond, BC, and have 4 adult children. Ray's deep hope for the church is rooted in the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and he believes that when we share our hearts, we are all enriched by the journey. So enjoy this conversation.
Ray, it is a great privilege to be with you in this podcast today. Thank you for taking the time to being with us, and I look forward so much to our conversation. Let's get right into things, Ray, because you have a rich background. You're a Treaty 8 Cree from the Swan River Band, and you grew up in a particular spiritual and religious upbringing. How did that help develop your faith? And most of all, who were the great influences in your walk with God and in your faith development?
Well, I think how it helps to embrace the gospel is the stories about Jesus inevitably are the things that come to mind. And when I was 19 and lost, and I remembered stories about Jesus. You always remember stories about Jesus. You couldn't grow up in Canada and not have heard stories about Jesus, whether it's just the ones you hear about at Christmas time, or if you happen to be forced to go to Sunday school like your mom does, makes you go. So then I don't think when you're young you realized how much your parents influence you. But later, maybe you do. Sometimes you resent your mother making you go to church, but then you realize she also took you to the library. I was writing about that the other day. She took me to the library. She made me go to church, and then it struck me that she was just trying to give you what you needed, or what she thought you needed to make it. So my mom, plus she's raised Roman Catholic, and she prayed. She raised her younger sisters. I was looking at a picture of her and her dad and her 3 younger sisters, because her mother had left at that point. And I realized, she took care of her younger sisters. And I used to ask her how she did that. She was kind of looking after her sisters. Probably started helping out when she was 6. And then the picture I saw, she was 8. And at that point, she was looking after her sisters, because my grandfather was going to war. And I realized, man, I used to ask her, how did you do that? And she said, I prayed every day. Because she was living with her grandmother, and her grandmother made him go to mass every day.
Every day?
Every day.
Wow.
He had to go.
Wow.
And then, and then the other influence was my older brother. Just because he had this born-again experience, and it changed his life. Or it seemed to me it changed his life. I was still in the party scene, and he was happier than I was. I was miserable. So, anyways, that's why you do drugs and you drink, is because you're miserable and you're trying to find something that'll make you feel better. But he came to faith. There was a guy, evangelist in those days, named Terry Winter, was doing
Yeah.
He was doing evangelistic crusades across Canada, and my older brother was at one of those meetings, and he came to faith, and eventually he's the one who sort of course, I'm an Anglican, so you can't say that he sort of, because I was already baptized in the United Church, so. But he sort of woke something in me, and that was significant. And then, of course, whoever is your minister, if you go to church, they always have an influence on you. In fact, I went to study where I did because I just looked at the people who had an impact in my life, and I said, well, where did they go to school to study ministry? So that I just went to the same school. So those were all influences. And then when I was in Regina going to school, started hanging out with these guys, guys like Clifford George and Eugene Passip, and they introduced me to Obies, and all these names were guys who were part of or had been influenced or knew about the sort of self-determination, but they were part of the whole thing that was happening down in the United States, the Aboriginal rights movement and all these guys. And they were a big influence because they taught me about ceremony and how language works and how story works, but it wasn't in a course. It was just hanging out with these guys, all those guys. And of course now the Indigenous Church helps you to see Jesus in a way that the seminary can never teach you how. You got to hang out with people around the gospel.
That's so rich. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Terry Winter, when I was newly ordained, he was someone I would watch on television. And I thought, I needed somebody like a Terry Winter in my life. And I was a minister in the United Church. So Terry Winter was going to give me another perspective, Ray. And then I can see why you'd have an influence on your brother. I mean, he was very winsome. But the family, this seems to be something that has been a constant theme, actually, Ray. I mean, I find it more within my Indigenous friends who I think in some ways lived at times a more connected life with their families than sometimes others did. But the influence of family was huge. But hanging out. I'm intrigued, Ray, where you've gone with all of this, and with that background. In 2014, you might not even remember it, a Concordia lecture, and you asked a really important question. And it's one that I know is on the minds of many people today. And you asked the question, is there an Indigenous Christian spirituality? And I think our audience would love to know someone with your unique perspective kind of give us a sense of where you've gone with that. I mean, since that's 10 years ago now. Is there an Indigenous Christian spirituality?
Well, I hope I said yes.
I think you did, yes.
No, I continue to, you see, because the whole thing, I mean, part of I remember that question or that thing that I was asking, part of it was because, the mainline denominations were working to see an Indigenous church, but they never could see it. It was there, but they never could see it. And because it doesn't look like the church that came out of Christendom. And how could it? I mean, but so then it was hanging out. It just reemphasized the fact that the way that the Indigenous Church grew in Canada and Indigenous spirituality was because they gathered around the gospel. They just people in houses reading the gospel, singing songs and praying and trying to find strength to just make it through life. And that was the Indigenous Church and the spirituality, and the elders wanted the gospel in the center of the sacred circle. So then that's what they did, and that's what you do. And as much as we're going through a time in Canada when, church involvement is diminishing. There's always this shuffling of the saints from one denomination to another, but overall, I think church attendance and things are going down in Canada. But yet, we continue to gather around the gospel. And then, as long as we do that, then there's a Christian witness in our communities and in our family. So then, that, to me, is what Indigenous spirituality is about. I mean, there's other things, but to me, it was about gathering around the gospel, and it still is. So that's kind of what I do. I mean, there's other things that I did in my theology. I shifted towards narrative. The big shifts were towards narrative because the gospel comes to us in story. And the other shift was to see that creation is the central, sort of, that's the thing that you need to see happening, is creation. I think being for a time in the evangelical church reads it through. When they think of salvation, I don't know, it's almost like they see the world as this dangerous place and they fail to see that it's a good world. It's creation. And so I shifted in my thinking, because that's how I saw Indigenous spirituality. It was about creation. And then salvation really is about reconciliation, bringing all things, sort of seeing this harmony that existed in Christ, whose creator and creation exist in perfect harmony, and seeing that was the goal. That was where we were going. So then salvation was about reconciliation and rejoining creator on this path to see this harmony and this, wholeness and unity that was the plan of the creator in the beginning, being restored. And so that was a big shift that happened for me.
No, Ray. I mean, this is very important. This is a perspective that gets lost. And I think, in a sense, it's a tradition that needs to be reclaimed. When you look, I've thought about this, and I've thought about it. Actually, what really provoked me on this, Ray, was a presentation you gave at the Leicester Randall Preaching Fellowship a couple of years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And, you got me thinking afterwards. And, you look at the Bible, and you look at Genesis, and then you look at Revelation, and it's a story of God's redeeming work to restore what has been broken, to bring it to a place of harmony. And it's through Christ that this occurs. We often think of the world as an extremely dark place from which we've sort of become extricated, rather than the place where God has put us to bear witness, but then also granting us the gift of eternal life as well. I think one of the things that I'm interested in, because I keep hearing this from Indigenous theologians, I heard it at Nate's last year, I heard it from Danny Zacharias, I'm hearing it from you, and that's gospel story. And what interests me is, what is it about the gospel stories, or are there particular aspects of the gospel stories of Christ that particularly resonate, Ray, with Indigenous people?
Well, let's see. Going back to, who's the guy, the preacher, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God?
Edwards.
Jonathan Edwards.
Jonathan Edwards.
So
wow.
if you, in his writings, he says, if he preached about hell to Indigenous people, it has no impact. It had no impact at all. But when he talked about the love of Jesus, that, I don't know if he said it or it's just my imagination, that made men cry. And even in the North, so Carmen Lansdowne, who's moderator of the United Church, I think she said that in her PhD thesis, she discovered for her people, Helsik, I think they're Helsik, from like Bella Bella area. What fascinated them was the teaching that you could make peace with your enemies without going to war. That's what impacted the Indigenous people. The love that Christ loves us. That's what changes people. And so that's the thing that you see in the stories about Jesus. And also that you could see yourself. The cool thing about Indigenous people is that although, we went through modernity too, they never, I'm sure you can find individuals where they weren't so enamored with technique as modern society was. And so, reading guys like Hans Fry, he would say, look, prior to and even after the Enlightenment, the whole way that you read the Bible was to see how your story fit into this gospel story. That was how you did exegesis.
Right.
But that becomes lost through modernity. Except it never gets lost in Indigenous people's lives. They don't. They just read the story and try to see how their life fits into this story.
And that makes it very much a living word. When I've been in Indigenous churches, where I remember once speaking, and we had the text of Zacchaeus and the story of Zacchaeus and the welcoming love of Jesus and the meal afterwards and the sitting down and being with someone who was an outcast. I mean, it was as if people were putting themselves in their conversations afterwards in the position of a Zacchaeus, or even putting themselves in the position of a Jesus, and Jesus being that sort of the welcoming, inviting, restoring person, and that's a part of the ministry of their church. So they took it and they internalized it. They didn't keep it at a distance. And so I think Indigenous people have something to teach us about the living nature of the word. Do you agree?
Yeah. Of course, there's an old book. It's not old, but called Mimesis. They make this statement. They say, now this is not Indigenous, but they just say, look, the way the Bible's written, if you think about it, there's quite a bit of room to read into what's going on. So that was kind of good stories do that.
I think that's also why, Ray, the gospel editors, the gospel, people who put the gospels together, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, didn't overly editorialize. It was a story, and there it was, particularly in Mark and Matthew and Luke. You move on and let the story speak for itself.
I know. I remember years ago. 3 of us were invited, Terry LeBlanc, myself, and Adrian Jacobs, were invited to go to Emmanuel College for a conference in Toronto. And we were supposed to tell the United Church why they were no longer evangelical. And Stan McKay was there.
Thanks, Ray.
Stan McKay was there and some other, I think, scholars. And it just struck me there. In my presentation, I said, well, one of the problems was that the gospel ceased to be a first order discourse for the United Church. Like, they did that because they were ashamed, I think, of what happened in the residential schools, and they wanted to distance themselves from any kind of, attempt to convert people. They wanted to just, because I kind of understand it, but once the gospel is no longer first order discourse, like when the story is no longer the first thing, well, then you don't have any language to talk about the Christian faith. And I'd sit there and I listen to religious studies scholars do this. They don't have anything to say because they don't know that language. And in one sense, the story itself has somehow, they find themselves outside of the story. Just somehow the story's done that themselves. And I thought that was fascinating. They were trying to say something. I remember listening to scholars trying to say something and they had nothing to say. They didn't have any words because they didn't want to use that language. I know that's kind of obscure, but I just thought that's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. I mean, which brings me to another question, really, Ray, which is, in a sense, the effect of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on those, denominations. I mean, I'm United Church, such as ours. And of course, it was critical of colonial powers and the church's participation in the work of the colonial powers, and the critique of the sort of the term Christianize Indigenous people. Is there a difference, right? And I mean, would this be helpful for people? Is there a difference between sort of Christianizing, to use that phrase, and it's loaded, with sharing the good news of Jesus Christ with people, regardless of who they are? Like, is there a difference, Ray?
Probably it's always happening. Both things are happening. Like, I don't think there's this either or thing. I think that people try to do the right thing. I think most people try to do the right thing. I don't think anybody, well, I'm sure there were trying to do things. You can find that. But I think lots of people who came, I think of residential schools, for example, why it went on as long as it did, because people thought that was what the right thing to do was. Like, that doesn't give them permission to do that. What I'm saying is, the reason there were residential schools is because all of Canadian society thought that's what you do to people who aren't the same as you. You try to make them like yourself. They didn't come over thinking like that. Lots of people came over like there wasn't enough land. Like my wife's relatives came over in 1910 from Northern Ireland because there wasn't enough land there for everybody. If you got 8 brothers and there's only 80 acres, well, you can't all stay there. So they come over and they don't got a lot, and they find a land that's welcoming. But then later they begin to think you got to make everybody like yourself, or at least those that are in power. And things just go sideways.
I just want to pause this conversation for a moment to tell you about the Bible course. Because whether you're a seasoned Bible reader or you're just starting on the journey, the Bible course offers a superb overview of the world's best-selling book. This 8-session course will help you grow in your understanding of the Bible. Using a unique storyline, the Bible course shows you how key events, books, and characters all fit together throughout the whole Bible. It's great for in-person groups or digital gatherings. It really can be used anywhere you like. Watch the first session for free and review the accompanying course guide. Go to biblecourse.ca to learn more. That's biblecourse.ca. And as always, the links for everything are down in the show notes.
They do, and yes, and one can get sort of caught up in a kind of I lived, as you know, in South Africa for years, and I witnessed the effects of the negative effects of sort of Christianization, of colonialization, working with it hand in hand, and then on the other hand, seeing the incredible Christian faith of the Black community. I mean,
yes.
and the Black churches. I'd go to a white church in Cape Town and preach to 100 people. I'd go to a township church. I'd preach to 500 people.
Yeah, I spent a month in South Africa just the end of 2023. I've been there.
Yeah, you were there recently, weren't you? Yeah.
So at first, when it comes to translation, I read this somewhere, so you'd have to check it out. But in the Anglican Church, for example, as long as Indigenous work continued to be oversaw by the Department of Mission in England, translation was important. As soon as Canada takes over, so the Indigenous Church, like the Anglican Church of Canada, as soon as it becomes a thing and it takes over the work with Indigenous people in Canada, the emphasis on language dies away. Because you see, Canada was so intent, like as soon as there's enough people here, then that's when Christendom, that's when, J.R. Miller says, that's when you shifted from cooperation to coercion. See, there's this shift that happens because suddenly you're trying to become this thing that has dominion from sea to sea, which is what Christendom is about and what politics is about. It's all about making some earthly kingdom. And then when you try to do it in the name of the church, Leslie Newbigin wrote, right? I think he's the one who wrote, he says, whenever a nation says that it's Christian and that they're going to establish heaven on earth, they end up bringing hell up instead.
Yes, right.
That's what they end up doing. And you know in South Africa that apartheid, they tried to find some theological justification for what they were doing. Like the apartheid church thought somehow they had found some theological justification. And I remember reading that book, Cry the Beloved Country, that, and the arguments that the, white people would use was like, well, black people just aren't as smart, so it's better that they are kept with their own rather than allow the exceptional one, because then he'll feel disjointed from his people. So better just to, it's just bizarre.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Alan Paton, who wrote that, just shook the foundations with that book. I mean, he just absolutely shook the foundations. And
but you see, things were happening even there in South Africa. I was because I was there visiting, and some guys were teaching at the University of the Western Cape. The South African apartheid government had no idea that there was this thing happening, and all of these good thinkers went to the University of the Western Cape. They just thought they'd stick these guys off in the bush, call it a university, but nothing would really happen there. And then that's where all the black theologians, that's where they all came out of, at least according to the people I talked to that they're right. I mean, when I was at the University of Cape Town, I mean, you look down your nose at the University of the Western Cape, and yet, people like Alan Bosak was there, and Russell Botman, who really was one of my heroes, was there. I mean, they actually, as you rightly said, they tried to push them to the boundaries, thinking that they were taking them out of the mainstream, when in fact they were providing an impetus to bring them in. It's the same in Canada. So then, as well, I'm not trying to say that it should happen that way. As the church and residential school, they're leaning on stuff to try to get rid of it, then something else comes up that's helpful. Self-determination and realizing that their version of Christianity was better than the one that they were being offered. So Indigenous people realize that. Although universities haven't helped all the time.
Yeah. No, I think that's true.
You see, there's always these two things that are going on. You got to somehow figure it out. Like universities are a great place to learn to think. You can think stuff. But at the same time, I remember talking to some elders in one community, and they were concerned because every time, he said, our kids go off to university and they come back and they hate the church. The church ran residential schools, but the government was the one who was in charge of residential schools, and somehow that's lost. And the nuance, people don't always see the nuance. And Indigenous people somehow are able to hold these two things together, which has helped me stay in the church, because lots of people think, why even stay in this thing? But because I see the elders and they somehow could hold these things together.
Yeah. Ray, you're an honorary assistant deacon at the cathedral in Vancouver now, right? And in the profile of you, I read this incredible line. It said, Ray's passion is to help as many people as possible hear the gospel. Well, we've got that loud and clear from you already. Those are my words. In their heart language. We've talked a little bit, you touched on translation a little bit, but tell us a little bit more about why you think translation of Bible into Indigenous language is important, or is it? And how does it make a difference in the lives of the people?
That heart language statement. So that's taken from, when there's going to be this riot, and then suddenly Paul talks to them. He begins to speak to them in Hebrew, and everybody sort of just calms down. And I thought, hey, that's kind of cool. And I'm sure I heard the idea from somebody else, Leslie Newbigin. But then I was also thinking about how suffering is heart language too. That, when you suffer, you see things and hear things in a different way. And I always thought that's where Christ meets us, is on the level of human emotion. And I think that you need to help people hear that in the language that they understand, that really speaks to their heart. And there's still lots of people in Canada who speak, that's their, Cree or Anishinaabe, that's their language. That's their heart language. That's the one that their mother spoke to them. And when you hear something said in the way that your mother's talked to you, then it impacts you, and it just pauses. Anything that helps us to pause and think about the words, like, that's what you need to do. Plus, Mark MacDonald said, Christianity is unique in that, where some other religious faiths try to keep everything sounding the same. Christianity, the more languages you hear the gospel, the better picture of Creator that you get. Like the more, like you just see how it's this awesome way of thinking about it. So that's why you need to continue to do translation, because language is always changing. It's always changing.
Always, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So then that's why you need. So that's what I was thinking. And also for young people like me who didn't have our language because, our grandparents or our parents decided it was just you faced too much persecution if you spoke that. So then they tried to, they're trying to do what they thought was best. To be able to learn a few words, like I think it's last author by the name of MacLeod. Every time you speak a word in your own language, you sort of you sort of undo colonialism just a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So then,
yeah, I think so too. There's a couple of things I've noticed in my current work, Ray. One of them is my engagement with Indigenous communities, particularly with the Mohawk translation and its release and all the discussions around that. Carmen was there, and Harvey Satiwas and others. But also my work with diaspora clergy and being in presentations on the Bible, where there are many languages represented. I think Mark MacDonald makes a good point. I think you hear the gospel differently when people hear it in a different language, or then they express in their own language what they've heard, and then in English tell them what they have heard in their own language. There is a richness to all of this. When you look at young people in Canada today, Ray, and I'm not just thinking of Indigenous, I'm thinking of all of us, really. What, as a teacher yourself, what do you think they are struggling with? What are the things that are really important in their minds? As a professor, what are you hearing in this very diverse matrix that we have of this country?
Well, young people want to know about their own cultural background. That's what I hear. So they, because they didn't grow up with it, and they didn't grow up with, at least I grew up, I could hunt, because I grew up outside of town. So, and the town itself wasn't very big. I mean, where I lived, the closest town wasn't that far away, but it was only 10,000 people. So that's not very big. So I grew up eating wild meat, fish, and the hunt is central to, spirituality. Like I remember I heard one, used to be Grand Chief, a friend of mine, he said, the whole thing about Cree spirituality is in the fall you pray for good hunting, and in the spring you give thanks for good hunting. And I used to think about it. Someone will ask, well, how do you know it was good hunting? In Northern Alberta, if you're alive in the spring, it was good hunting.
Yeah, survival.
Because it's cold. But, you see what I said earlier about creation. You just learn to see that the earth is a good place and it provides. It's always the creator that's provided. So I think about those things. And then young people who grow up in cities, they don't have that. They don't know that. They don't even know, they don't. So then language and sometimes some of the ceremonies help them to feel like they are, like it's something for them to sort of anchor their identity to, because they feel like they don't have any identity. But it's tough. It's tough because, if you don't grow up with language, like me, I'm too old. I'll never get it back. So I think about that. And, but young people today, especially in cities, you can see that in, like, when I was in New Zealand, visit the Maori Anglican Church, there's a revival of Maori language because in one sense, it helps them, young people, to feel like they are who they're supposed to be. So there's a revival of Maori language in Hawaii, the same among young Hawaiians. There's a revival of language. I don't know that we're seeing that in Canada yet.
I think it's in pockets, isn't it? I mean, I see it in pockets. Ray, we're winding down now a little bit, there are a couple of sort of personal things I'd just like to ask you, really. One of them is, how do you balance your life? And how can you help others have a sense of balancing their life? You have your faith in the church, you have your academic work, you have Elaine, you have your family, you have a great bond. How do you balance the life between all the different things that you're engaged in order that, you can remain both productive and faithful?
I think if you ask my wife and my family, they'd say I don't balance it very well. Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. All of the thing that I remember about that, I could tell you what those habits are. The only thing he uses this illustration. If you don't put the big rocks in first, you can't get them in after. So put the big rocks in first.
Yeah.
So I try to keep the morning and evening office. I was thinking about that today, the gospel. Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, right? And then he does all these things. They bring a bunch of people and he heals them. But then he goes up to the mountain. He prays. Jesus prays throughout the gospel. He prays. So then I try to pray. Number 2, I try to keep the gospel story as its first order discourse. How does my life fit into this? Do that through gospel-based discipleship. And the other thing is to learn to speak from the heart. I mean, the biggest thing about balance is to speak from your heart, not primarily from your head. That's the struggle that academics face the most, because academics, they just talk out of their head. Most, not all, but you got to speak from the heart. What's really going on?
Yeah.
So then that's kind of.
And I would say, Ray, to preachers too. I mean, you preach the gospel from the heart. Talking about preaching from the heart and talking about sort of things that really matter. It's about 3 years ago, almost. Next month, that I did my first podcast with Rick Tobias at Young Street Mission. And he, at the end of the podcast, he said, would you pray for me? And ever since then, every person I've interviewed, I have ask, what is it that we, the listeners of this podcast, can do to pray for you? What would you like us to pray for Ray Aldred and your work? What's on your heart and your mind that you'd like our prayers?
Well, pray for Ray Aldred. Pray for the Indigenous Church, because, both the United Church and the Anglican Church, sort of the mainline, the big denomination, sort of gave the okay for churches to become self-determining. The Anglican, Indigenous, the Sacred Circle, and then in the United Church. Yet, it's hard. Things are kind of stumbling along. So pray for the Indigenous Church. And for me, well, I was reading in Revelation the other day, and it struck me that sometimes you lose that the church, which church is it? The one where he says, I have this against you, you've kind of left your first love. And I think Epiphany is all about the wonder. When my youngest son was born, I remember when he came out of his mother, because I was there helping. I don't know how much a help I was. But I remember I saw him before Elaine, and I said, look, Elaine. And that look is the same. Behold, look. And I think sometimes I want to have eyes to see and ears to hear, so that I don't lose that when it comes to the gospel.
The sense of wonder. Ray, thank you. Thank you for your candor. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your work that you do. And be assured that we will both pray for the Indigenous Church, and we'll pray for you, and that the wonder of the Lord will continue to be with us and to sustain us. On behalf of the Bible Society, Ray, thank you so much for your time. This has been terrific. God bless you.